By day, the Spartans were the terror of the ancient world. Soldiers bred for war, disciplined beyond comprehension, their bodies and minds forged into living weapons. But when the night descended and the fires of the war camp burned low, another world emerged, one whispered of in shadows, hidden even from their allies. A world where power was measured not by the spear, but by the body. Sparta is remembered as the land of warriors, a society that stripped away comfort, individuality, and freedom in the name of strength. From childhood, Spartan boys were torn from their families and placed into the agoge, the brutal state-run system of training that raised them into soldiers. They were starved to teach them stealth, beaten to toughen their skin, and tested in ways designed to break the weak. Yet among these trials lay something that few history books dare to describe: sexual domination as a form of control. Unlike Athens, which embraced philosophy and art, Sparta prided itself on silence. Secrets were its shield. But even the most disciplined society cannot hide everything. Roman chroniclers, Greek rivals, and later historians left behind fragmented accounts, hints of what took place when Spartan warriors sought to bind loyalty with more than just oaths, and what they described was both shocking and disturbing. Forbidden rituals, coerced intimacy, and practices that blurred the line between loyalty and abuse. To understand why these acts existed, we must remember Sparta's obsession with unity. The Spartan army was not simply a collection of men. It was a single organism, one body, one will, one terrifying force. To achieve this, every soldier had to surrender not just his freedom, but his very self. And so, the walls of the war camp became places of secrecy, where sexuality itself was twisted into another weapon of war. But what truly happened in those barracks at night? What rituals could be so disturbing that even the ancients themselves debated whether to speak of them? The answer, as we shall see, is darker than you imagine. Throughout this story, we will peel back the veil on practices Sparta buried beneath its iron discipline. We will explore how sexuality was used not for pleasure, but for power, how intimacy became a tool of domination, loyalty, and submission, and how a culture that claimed to be built on strength and purity was hiding a forbidden world, one that would haunt its legacy forever. Desire has always been a weapon. In the ancient world, it was a force that could topple kings, shift empires, and bend men to the will of others. For the Spartans, desire was not left to chance. It was harnessed, controlled, and twisted into something far more dangerous. Within the war camps, sexuality became a system of command. The older warrior and the younger recruit were not simply companions. They were bound in a relationship of dominance and obedience. What outsiders might see as intimacy was, in truth, a calculated form of control. The boy surrendered not only his body but his will, learning that resistance meant isolation and obedience meant belonging. Sparta was not alone in this use of power. In Persia, kings collected harems where women were held as symbols of status. In Rome, emperors surrounded themselves with concubines and slaves, their chambers becoming theaters of corruption. Viking chieftains arranged marriages as political bargains, using women as tokens of alliance. Across civilizations, sexuality was currency, but in Sparta, it was forged into a weapon as sharp as the spear. The psychology behind it was chilling. By controlling intimacy, Spartan leaders ensured absolute loyalty. A warrior who gave everything, even his most private self, could not turn against the brotherhood without also turning against himself. These practices blurred the lines between devotion and coercion, creating bonds that were both unbreakable and deeply disturbing. What was forbidden in other lands was enforced in Sparta. Taboos that elsewhere carried shame were here reframed as duty. Yet even in their own time, whispers circulated. Other Greeks questioned whether the Spartans had gone too far, whether their pursuit of unity had cost them their very humanity. But to the Spartan mind, this was not corruption, it was necessity. a city that relied on perpetual war, that ruled, through fear over countless slaves, believed survival demanded more than discipline. It demanded control at every level, from the battlefield to the body. And yet, even this was only the beginning. Because the most shocking scandals, the events that would stain Sparta's legacy forever, were still to come. And when they surfaced, they revealed the true cost of turning desire into domination. Every empire has its scandals. For Rome, it was the orgiastic chambers of Caligula. For the Persians, the endless intrigues of the harem. And for Sparta, it was the agoge, a system meant to forge warriors, but one that concealed within it a disturbing secret. The greatest scandal of Spartan life was not a single night of excess, but an institution that shaped every boy who dreamed of becoming a man of war. From the age of 7, Spartan children were torn from their families and placed into state-controlled barracks. Here they were stripped of softness, comfort, and freedom. They were beaten, starved, humiliated, and hardened into soldiers. But the true scandal lay in the bonds forced upon them. Each boy was paired with an older warrior, a mentor, yes, but also something more. What was presented as a noble relationship, a passage of loyalty and instruction, was also a system of sexual coercion. The older warrior demanded not only obedience in training, but submission in private. Ancient writers, like Xenophon and Plutarch, record these relationships with unease. They describe them with vague phrases: companionship, love of the youth, a bond of arms. But behind the euphemisms lurks something far darker. To resist was not only dangerous, but dishonorable. The boy who refused his mentor risked ridicule, punishment, even expulsion from the very society that demanded absolute loyalty. To submit, however, meant acceptance, protection, and survival. The scandal was not just in the act itself, but in its normalization. An entire state wielding sexuality as another weapon of discipline. There are stories whispered of boys who resisted. One youth, confronted by his assigned mentor, refused submission and endured savage beatings. He became an outcast, mocked by peers, and was said to have disappeared from Spartan life altogether. His silence in history speaks volumes. How many others were erased, their defiance buried beneath the legend of Spartan unity? The consequences of this system stretched beyond the boyhood barracks. As these youths grew into warriors, they carried with them bonds that were both intimate and haunted. They fought side by side, not merely as comrades, but as men bound by secrets, humiliation, and loyalty sealed through coerced acts. This created a cohesion that terrified enemies, but at what cost? For every victory on the battlefield, there was a silent battlefield within, where identity and autonomy had been sacrificed in the name of obedience. Other Greeks looked on with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Athenians mocked Spartans for their hidden practices, ridiculing their so-called discipline as little more than sanctioned corruption. Yet even in mockery, there was fear. For while Athens debated, Sparta conquered, and the secret that fueled its armies remained locked within the walls of the war camp. But the scandal of the agoge was not the final outrage. For in the shadows of politics, within the halls of power, sexuality would become an even greater weapon. The war camp's darkest rituals would spill into Spartan intrigue, where betrayal, seduction, and whispered secrets would shape the very destiny of kings. In every empire, power has always been tied to desire. In Sparta, this truth was sharpened into a blade. What began in the barracks as loyalty and submission soon seeped into the very core of politics, where the stakes were no longer training drills or war games, but the fate of kings, generals, and the city itself. Sparta's rulers understood that control of bodies could translate into control of armies, and control of armies meant control of the state. The bonds formed in the agoge, that hidden web of submission and dominance, followed men into adulthood. Mentors who had once demanded obedience in the shadows now commanded loyalty on the battlefield, and the relationships born of compulsion, could be used, twisted, and exploited by those who sought power. There are whispers of Spartan kings who bent this system for personal gain. One such tale speaks of King Agesilaus, whose own early years in the agoge had left him deeply tied to his mentor. When he rose to power, his rivals accused him of manipulating younger men in turn, binding them not through laws or promises, but through the same intimate control he had once endured. Whether these rumors were truth or slander, they reveal how sexuality became a political weapon. In a society where every warrior was shaped by coerced intimacy, accusations of abuse were not just moral stains, they were political daggers. Plots brewed in these unspoken spaces. A general who had the loyalty of his former companions could outmaneuver rivals in council. Alliances forged in private carried weight far beyond the battlefield. But scandal was always waiting to erupt. When one leader fell, enemies rushed to expose his hidden appetites, using them as proof of corruption, weakness, or dishonor. The manipulation of desire was not confined to men alone. Spartan women, though barred from the war camps, wielded sexuality in their own battles of power. Unlike women in Athens, Spartan women were trained, educated, and outspoken. They're rare. Freedoms gave them a dangerous influence. A wife could expose her husband's secrets. A mother could shame a rival by questioning the purity of his training. And whispers from women's quarters often carried as much weight as the decrees of kings. In the dark game of Spartan politics, sexuality was not only a weapon of men, but of women who understood the cost of silence. Religion added yet another layer of intrigue. Spartan priests and guardians of ritual publicly preached discipline and purity. But behind closed doors, these same figures were accused of turning a blind eye, or even taking part. To question them was heresy, yet their hypocrisy became an open secret. The contradiction was staggering. A society that praised its warriors as paragons of restraint, while tolerating, and at times institutionalizing, practices it dared not name aloud. And so politics in Sparta was not merely a matter of law, war, or diplomacy. It was a labyrinth of secrets, of whispered accusations and dangerous loyalties born in the barracks. A man's fate could be decided not by the strength of his spear, but by the shadows of his past. Shadows his rivals were eager to drag into the light. But what of the ordinary Spartan? How did these secrets trickle down into the daily lives of those who were not kings or generals? For while the elite waged their battles with seduction and betrayal, the common soldier, the helot slave, and the Spartan wife lived under the constant weight of these hidden practices. And their world was no less haunted by the taboos of the war camp. History often lingers on kings, generals, and rulers. But to grasp the true weight of Sparta's disturbing practices, we must descend from the marble halls of politics into the grit of everyday life, where soldiers, wives, and slaves endured the shadow of the war camp. Here, the forbidden rituals that bound elites trickled down into the blood and breath of an entire society. For the common Spartan soldier, life was dominated by the barracks. Until the age of 30, a man was forbidden to live with his wife. Marriage was permitted, but cohabitation was delayed, a practice unheard of among other Greeks. A young husband might sneak into his own home at night, steal moments with his bride, then vanish before dawn, returning to the embrace of the war camp. The city had no interest in fostering family bonds during these years. Loyalty belonged to the state, not to wives or children. The result was a society where intimacy was fractured, compartmentalized, and overshadowed by the ever-present power of military ritual. For women, the contradictions were staggering. Spartan women enjoyed freedoms that shocked outsiders. They owned land, managed estates, and spoke boldly in public. Rights denied to Athenian women. Yet when it came to sexuality, their lives were twisted by the same state demands that governed the men. A woman might be ordered to marry for eugenics rather than love, paired with a man chosen for strength and lineage rather than affection. If her husband was deemed unfit to produce strong heirs, she might be commanded to conceive with another man. even with her husband's consent, enforced by the state. In a culture obsessed with breeding warriors, a woman's body was not hers alone. It was a vessel for the army. The Helots, Sparta's vast population of enslaved people, bore the heaviest burden of all, forced laborers from conquered lands. They outnumbered their Spartan masters many times over. Fear of revolt haunted the city. To control them, Spartans devised rituals of humiliation. During certain festivals, Helots were made to sing, dance, and perform in grotesque parodies for the amusement of their masters. But some accounts hint at darker rituals, where Helots were forced into sexual degradation as demonstrations of their subjugation. What was framed as entertainment was in truth a display of domination, a reminder that even their bodies did not belong to them. And yet, while Spartan elites treated Helots as less than human, they also depended on them intimately. A Spartan soldier who spent his prime years in the barracks might secretly rely on a Helot woman for comfort, or worse, exploit her with impunity. These encounters left behind unspoken scars, unacknowledged children, and stories erased from official history. In the double standards of Spartan life, what was sacred for citizens was shameful for slaves. Though both were shaped by the same machinery of control, the contradictions extended further. While Spartan men were compelled to form intimate bonds with their comrades in war, any sign of similar behavior among Helots was treated as rebellion. What strengthened the army and citizens was punished as corruption in slaves. Discipline for some, degradation for others, yet the line between them blurred in the shadows of the war camp. Daily life in Sparta was thus haunted by taboos. Children grew up knowing that the path to adulthood ran through rituals no one dared to name aloud. Wives watched as their husbands gave more of themselves to the barracks than to the household. Slaves endured degradation as a matter of policy. The entire city was trapped in a cycle where sexuality was never private, never free, always twisted into the service of the state. But a society can only endure so much. There comes a moment when the very practices meant to preserve unity begin to tear it apart, and in Sparta, that moment would arrive, when scandal, rebellion, and the arrogance of leaders push the system to its breaking point. Every forbidden system eventually meets its breaking point. For Sparta, the rituals of loyalty and domination that once seemed like the iron foundation of their society began to crumble under the weight of excess, scandal, and hypocrisy. What had started as discipline became indulgence. What was once hailed as strength was exposed as weakness. And the turning point was as dramatic as it was inevitable. The seeds of collapse were sown in the very structure of the agoge. For centuries, Sparta had justified its use of coercion and forced intimacy as a means of forging warriors bound by unbreakable ties. And for a time, it worked. The Spartan phalanx became the terror of Greece, its soldiers fighting with an almost supernatural unity. But over time, what was once secret ritual became corrupted by ambition. Men who had been shaped by the system began to manipulate it for personal gain. Leaders demanded not loyalty, but submission. Older warriors no longer guided youths for the sake of training, but indulged in unchecked desires. The fragile balance between discipline and exploitation shattered. One story tells of a young recruit who resisted his appointed mentor, refusing to submit to what was demanded of him in the barracks. His defiance spread whispers of rebellion among his peers. Rather than honor his courage, the authorities silenced him. Some accounts say he was expelled. Others claim he was executed under the guise of punishment for cowardice. His fate served as a warning to others, but it also revealed the truth. The system was no longer about loyalty, it was about fear. The cracks widened in the 4th century BCE. Sparta, long the unchallenged master of Greek warfare, met its greatest humiliation at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. Facing the Thebans, Sparta confronted an enemy whose secret weapon mirrored and, in some ways, surpassed their own, the Sacred Band of Thebes. This elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers fought not with shame or secrecy, but with pride. Their love for one another was celebrated, not hidden in barracks or cloaked in taboo. On that battlefield, the Thebans shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Their open devotion proved stronger than Sparta's forced submission. The irony was devastating. A rival city had taken what Sparta concealed and turned it into a weapon of glory. The defeat at Leuctra was more than a military disaster. It was a cultural humiliation. For centuries, Sparta had hidden its practices, framing them as noble bonds of loyalty. Now the world saw that what Sparta tried to conceal, others had embraced openly, and to greater effect. The hypocrisy of Sparta's secrecy was laid bare. Inside the city, the fallout was just as destructive. Scandals erupted within the royal families. Accusations of corruption and sexual exploitation spread among the ruling elite. Kings and generals turned on one another, using the shadow of the agoge as a weapon in political feuds. To be accused of abusing the system was to be marked as unworthy of leadership. But by this time, nearly every man of power had skeletons in his past. Silence became impossible. The helots, too, began to resist with greater boldness. Their forced humiliations, their endless subjugation, reached a boiling point. Uprisings shook the Spartan countryside. Some whispers suggest that helot rebellions were fueled not just by hunger or oppression, but by rage at the sexual abuses they endured at the hands of their masters. In trying to dominate everybody under its control, Sparta had provoked the fury of those it thought powerless. And then there were the wives. Spartan women, empowered with unusual freedoms and responsibilities, grew increasingly disillusioned. They managed estates while their husbands lived in barracks. They bore children often not for love, but for the state. And they saw, more clearly than anyone, the corruption of the system that consumed their sons and husbands. When women began to question the wisdom of leaders, the myth of Spartan unity was exposed as nothing more than a fragile illusion. The turning point was not a single moment, but a cascade of betrayals, humiliations, and defeats. What once bound Sparta together now tore it apart. Their greatest strength, the forced intimacy of the war camp, had become their greatest weakness. It undermined morale, corrupted leadership, fueled rebellion, and left them vulnerable to enemies who understood the same weapon could be wielded without secrecy or shame. The Spartans had believed they could control desire, bend it to their will and make it serve the state. But in the end, it was desire, abused, corrupted, and weaponized, that helped bring their society to its knees. And the consequences of that collapse would echo long after the fires of the Spartan war camps burned out. But what happened after the fall? How did the world remember these scandals? And what traces remain today, buried in the soil of Greece, in the whispers of ancient historians, and in the warnings of those who came after? To answer that, we must turn to the long shadow of consequence. When Sparta finally began to unravel, the consequences of its hidden practices stretched far beyond the walls of its war camps. The scandals, the humiliations, the rituals of submission, all of these left marks not only on the soldiers who endured them, but on the very memory of the Spartan Empire. What was once a symbol of strength became a cautionary tale of how taboo practices, when left unchecked, can corrode a civilization from within. In the immediate aftermath of Sparta's decline, rival Greek states wasted no time in mocking its hypocrisy. Athenian writers, already disdainful of Sparta's obsession with secrecy, began to expose the rumors they had whispered for centuries. They ridiculed the agoge not as a noble system of education, but as a theater of abuse. They painted Spartans as men who preached discipline but practiced corruption. What had once been whispered in shadows now became part of the public discourse, a weapon wielded by enemies eager to tarnish the Spartan legend. Roman chroniclers later took up the story. The Romans admired Sparta for its martial prowess, its ruthless simplicity, and its legendary unity. But even they could not ignore the darker undercurrents. Roman historians spoke of Spartan customs with a mix of fascination and revulsion. presenting the city as a place where strength and perversion walked hand in hand. To them, Sparta was both an ideal of military power and a warning of how sexual excess could rot the foundation of an empire. Archaeological evidence remains sparse, but fragments hint at the truth. Inscriptions describing mentorship bonds, barracks, unearthed with signs of ritualistic life, and scattered references in ancient plays all confirm that something unusual and disturbing lurked within Spartan culture. We do not find explicit confessions carved in stone, but what survives between the lines of history is just as damning. A society so disciplined that it erased its own secrets, leaving only faint echoes for us to reconstruct. The long-term cultural impact was profound. Other Greek states, particularly Athens and Thebes, used Sparta as a foil. Where Athens embraced philosophy, debate, and public love of beauty, it portrayed Sparta as dark, brutal, and repressed. Thebes, with its sacred band, directly challenged Sparta's hypocrisy, presenting a vision of open warrior lovers who fought proudly, without shame. In this way, the very practices Sparta had tried to conceal helped shape the identity of its rivals, forcing them to define themselves against the Spartan model. The echoes did not fade with antiquity. In the medieval world, whispers of Sparta's war camps resurfaced in discussions of military orders like the Knights Templar. Just as Sparta had been accused of cloaking taboo practices in the name of discipline, the Templars were rumored to mask forbidden rites behind vows of secrecy and loyalty. In both cases, sexual taboo became a political weapon. Accusations of corruption and forbidden acts were used to justify their downfall. History, it seems, remembered the Spartans not for what they claimed to be, but for the scandals they could never fully erase. The consequences also reached into modern times. When militaries and secret fraternities impose rituals of humiliation, hazing, and coerced intimacy, they echo the same logic that once guided the agoge. Break the individual, bind him to the group. The scars left by such practices are psychological, as much as physical. Just as Spartan youths were taught that resistance meant isolation, so too do modern initiations exploit the same fear of exclusion. The methods may differ, but the shadow is the same. And yet, the fascination with Sparta remains. Historians, archaeologists, and military strategists continue to debate whether its practices were exaggerated by rivals, or whether the reality was even darker than the sources suggest. The absence of definitive proof fuels the imagination. Each fragment, each rumor, each veiled reference becomes another piece of a puzzle that refuses to be completed. Perhaps this is the greatest consequence of all, that Sparta's darkest secrets remain hidden, half revealed, haunting us with the possibility of truths we may never fully uncover. The empire that sought to control desire could not control its own legacy. Its secrets, once tools of unity, became weapons of humiliation in the hands of enemies. Its soldiers, once paragons of discipline, became symbols of corruption in the eyes of history. And its memory, once exalted, remains forever scarred by the taboos it tried to bury. But if this is what history records, fragments, rumors, and whispers, what of today? Do we not still live in a world where power is cloaked in secrecy, where scandals emerge from the shadows of politics, religion, and war? The question now is not whether Sparta was unique, but whether its legacy is still with us, repeating itself in forms both familiar and terrifying. Sparta's legacy is one of paradox. It is remembered as the greatest warrior society of the ancient world, a people who lived and died for discipline, honor, and the state. But when we peel away the layers of myth, what emerges is something far more disturbing. A culture where sexuality itself was twisted into a weapon, where intimacy was controlled, corrupted, and wielded in ways that left scars not only on individuals, but on history itself. The most shocking revelations of Sparta's war camps are not just tales of abuse or scandal. They are lessons about the fragility of power. By forcing children into a system that demanded submission, Sparta ensured loyalty, but also planted seeds of trauma. By treating women as vessels of the state, it produced heirs but denied love. By humiliating slaves, it maintained domination but sowed rebellion. Each practice brought short-term strength at the cost of long-term decay. And yet, these taboos did not vanish with Sparta's fall. They echo through history. In Rome, emperors like Caligula and Nero turned their private chambers into theaters of excess, wielding sexuality as a tool of dominance. In medieval Europe, the accusations leveled against the Knights Templar eerily mirrored those whispered about Sparta. Charges of secret rites, forbidden intimacy, and loyalty sealed through humiliation. In every age, societies that thrive on secrecy and submission eventually face the same reckoning. Even today, the shadows of Sparta stretch into the modern world. Militaries around the globe still rely on rituals of breaking and binding recruits. Hazing, humiliation, and coerced displays of loyalty remain disturbingly familiar echoes of the agoge. In fraternities, elite schools, and clandestine brotherhoods, practices designed to enforce obedience often flirt with the same taboos that haunted ancient war camps. The methods may be modern, but the logic is as old as Sparta. Control intimacy, and you control the soul. What is most unsettling is how little has changed in human nature. Scandals of political power, sexual abuse within institutions, and the weaponization of secrecy continue to emerge in our headlines. The world reacts with outrage, yet the patterns repeat. Just as Sparta concealed its practices beneath a cloak of discipline and purity, so too do modern powers cloak themselves in rhetoric of tradition, loyalty, and honor. The darker truths only surface when the system begins to collapse, when whispers become confessions, when secrets can no longer be contained. The unanswered mysteries of Sparta remain tantalizing. Did the agoge's rituals go even further than what ancient writers dared record? Were there ceremonies hidden in the night that left no trace but memory? Did Spartan leaders deliberately destroy evidence to protect their image? These questions remind us of how much history is shaped not by what survives, but by what is erased. Perhaps the most chilling thought is not what we know about Sparta, but what we never will. And so we are left with a haunting reflection. Sparta's greatness was built on control, but that very control carried within it the seeds of destruction. It created warriors who fought like one body, yet it also created fractures too. Perhaps the true horror is not what happened in Sparta, but the realization that these practices were not unique, that across empires, ages, and continents, the same taboos have been played out again and again, and perhaps, even now, they are playing out still. The Spartans believed that by controlling every aspect of life, even the most intimate, they could build a society stronger than any other. In the end, they proved the opposite. Their legacy is not only the spear and the shield, but also the scars left behind by secrets too dark to name. And as we look to our own world, with its scandals, its cover-ups, its whispered truths, we must ask ourselves, what other secrets lie buried in history? And what secrets are still being written, waiting to be unearthed by future generations?